Now, Kaymakli was found just a few years later. But here's the wild thing. It's 5.5 miles away. Okay? Why is that wild? Because underneath Derinkuyu is a main corridor. There's like a main corridor, like if you had buildings attached to each other, right? And there's a tunnel that goes from Derinkuyu all the way to Kaymakli.
Whoa.
5.5 miles underground.
Crazy.
Which means that those people knew enough about how they couldn't go above ground. Hey, I want to go see your cousin John in Kaymakli. I'm in Derinkuyu, right? I haven't visited him in a long time. Why wouldn't they just go up and go around? Instead, they literally travel underground between them, and the only reason you would do that is if it wasn't safe to be above ground. And now, why wouldn't it safe to be above ground? I don't think it's based on flooding. I think it's based on the concept of like a nuclear winter. Right, where you would basically be so volatile, not only like potentially radioactivity, but even things like a catastrophic climate that was just dipping all over the place, and like it was almost completely inhospitable to live out there. And the idea is that they built these to survive these events, and that the only reason they did that is because a previous event their ancestors had survived through. And then they told them, and like, you know, hey, if we're gonna survive the next one, we need to build these underground cities. Which that area of Turkey is literally in the center of the ancient world.
When do you think these underground cities were built?
That's the ultimate question. Nobody knows. And here's the weird thing. None of the material from these giant underground cities that they excavated has ever been found. It's not like they went up to the front and they found like this huge pile of rock.
Weird.
Like, hey, look at that. We can, because they can help.
Why wouldn't some of, you know, their tools and stuff be preserved, given that it's underground?
Nothing has ever been found.
Why is that?
Well, because things degrade. We have to imagine geologic time.
Underground, though, you'd assume maybe
you still have mice and rats and things, and you have water dripping, and we need to try to imagine. It's been 500 years, right, since, you know, we went through the Industrial Revolution and back to medieval times, back to then, and look at all we've achieved in that. Okay, that 500-year period. Now imagine thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Yep.
You know, potentially 10,000 years. I believe that those were built well over 10,000 years ago. Well over. I mean, they had to have been built before the Younger Dryas catastrophes, because there'd be no other, because we haven't had anything like that since.
Well, that would be my guess. Again, I'm a total amateur when it comes to this stuff, but I would guess that a greater percentage of things would be preserved if it's an underground city than if it's above ground. There's just less environmental kind of
but the problem is they were reused.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and this is where scientists I believe have gotten the dating completely wrong.
How do you know that they were reused?
Because when they first found them and they went down in, they did find stuff. They found evidence of Hittites and evidence of ancient cultures that are not like ancient, they're like mid-ancient, right? So, you know, Hittites in different time period of that, we're talking like, you know, maybe 2,500, 3,000 years ago, right? They found evidence of residency from them, where they were maybe hiding from armies or going under there for many reasons. It was a very dangerous time. Much of the world, the Assyrian and Urartian and Medes culture and the Babylonians and all of these cultures were battling, fighting. It was a very volatile time period in history. And so, yeah, you could have cultures try to hide down there. It wouldn't be the best idea, but I'm sure some did. And so that may have actually been one of the reasons why it was kind of covered up and not found for a long time, was because it was one of those places they were kind of like hiding out or something, right? But scientists and archaeologists have determined based on finding that that's who built it, which is kind of silly, right? If Jesse goes over to an ancient monument and puts his name on it, and then 1,000 years later we find that Jesse's name is still like carved into it, did Jesse build it?
Not necessarily.
No, if like it doesn't, it's kind of a silly.
But we can't know that it was built earlier, also.
Well, but the thing is, why would they do that? Why build a giant underground city and go to that kind of length of work if you're just doing it to hide from an army somewhere?
Yeah, fair enough.
Which they could literally just starve you out and like block. It doesn't
Not a
make
good
sense.
strategy, yeah.
No, you could literally they could like pour oil in and then just like set the whole inner place on fire. All these different means they could have done. All various different horrible things they could have done. But the only thing that makes sense if you look at the concentration of these underground cities and how it was the center of the ancient world is that they would have had pilgrimages knowing and reading the stars. Now that gets back to Göbekli Tepe because look at the pillars of Göbekli Tepe they're just basically star constellations.
Isn't it like a sun calendar?
It's a calendar. It's an astronomical calendar. What I believe its purpose was, my personal opinion is its purpose was to track the great year, to track cycles. And it was an astronomical spot that was its purpose, is to track cycles.
What is the great year? Just the concept of a year?
No. Okay, so the great year is based on what's called the precession of the equinox.
Okay.
It is because how the Earth wobbles because of the gravitational influences of this binary companion. I told you the entire solar system is influenced, okay?
This is fascinating. So basically this 26,000 year cycle where true north involves a different star. Right now it's Polaris. And other times it involves. But what's the conventional astronomical, explanation for why, all these planets, have kind of wobbling gravitational orbits, and how the entire axis of the solar system is actually on kind of a wobble? It's tilted.
Not a lot of people talk about it.
Is it literally just dismissed? Is there not some convention? Because there's certain things like how the moon was formed.
Yeah, which is really mysterious. Actually, by the way,
it's such BS when you hear the conventional explanation.
It came together perfectly in a perfect ratio between the sun and the moon and the Earth. No, it's like
it's like an asteroid hit the Earth. No. And then part of the Earth came out of the Earth into this perfect, thing.
It's impossible.
Makes no sense.
It's impossible.
Into this thing that, you never see the dark side of it. It's this perfect, and it's 1/400th the size of the Earth, and it's 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun. And it just doesn't, the conventional explanation that you can kind of definitively say is wrong, and then I think where you have to be epistemically humble, to me at least, I don't have a great theory, maybe you do, is I don't know what formed that thing. But what's the conventional explanation for, the wobbling gravitational axis, the slanted gravitational axis of the entire solar system?
I think some kind of a Milky Way interaction of outer things and inner things with the sun. I've never heard of anything definitive that's come from to explain that. If anything, I told you that Miles Standish had said mathematically, they were they miscalculated all these things, and then people are like, oh, never mind. It's been really weird.
Can we track the emergence of the conventional explanation? Because I often think that's a really important.
Again, I'm not an astrophysicist, so that would be a good question for others to bring up. You
said there's somebody at Caltech who's
So Caltech,
because I want to interview that person.
I actually emailed him and he never got back to me. And if he's listening to this, I'm still open to that reply.
Email, man. Let's figure out how to get in touch with him.
There's a number of experts at Caltech that use mathematics and based on data from probes to study an outer solar system. Okay, and they determined that based on the movement of Kuiper Belt objects, that they're being super skewed and perturbed by something. Okay. And that the way that Caltech, and again, if anyone wants to just look up Caltech and Planet 10 or Planet 9. It used to be called Planet 10, then they demoted it to Planet 9. Look into that. They have extremely compelling data that backs all this up, that mathematically Planet 10, I'm going to call it 10 because I think Pluto we should just keep it whatever it was, but we'll call it Planet 10, that it absolutely exists.
Yeah.
And again, why would you have a planet that's completely rogue, that's not part of another system?
Well, I'm just even thinking, again, my stupid math, right? The sun only has so much gravitational pull. Pluto is part of the sun's, gravitational field of influence because it's so small.
Well, it looks like it was a moon of Jupiter that got thrown out beyond that area.
But things, my guess would be that something 4 to 5 times the size of the Earth that's beyond the perimeter of Pluto even.
Oh, way beyond.
Might have trouble being part of
Why
the
would it be
sun's
part of exactly? It wouldn't make it
gravitational
makes no
influence?
sense. In fact,
I don't know, but I need
the
to
sun plays
do the math on it.
Exactly. There's no influence that far out at that point. We're
Right.
talking about something that would be like doesn't make any sense that it would be having a consistent type of elliptical orbit.
Do we know the conventional explanation there? Like,
well,
what-
no, they've tried to deny that it exists. That's, as I've said, Caltech is the only modern institute
okay, so
that's supporting that.
this thing gets announced in the 90s.
Yes.
Sorry to harp
Yeah, no,
on it. I think
please,
it's
it's
so
fine.
important.
I know, it's incredibly
So
interesting.
it gets announced in the 90s. NASA's like, this is thing, you know, it's Planet 10 or whatever. And then, Standish comes in, and then he's like, it's actually, forget about it. And so Planet 10 goes away
show
too.
you. Yeah, let me
Planet
show
10,
you.
like people forget about Planet 10.
Yeah, exactly.
at that
Because
point.
of, I'm telling you, it's because of Miles Standish with this whole idea that mathematically they made a mistake and that it never existed.
Pioneer never shot Planet 10. It was just they never got footage of it. It was just
You can't
based
get
on
footage.
It was just based on
Data.
the wobbling,
And
the
data,
gravitational influence.
yeah, and data is very easy to here.
Wait,
Here,
but
take a look at this. I think it would probably be helpful for you to look at that. That's the page from it. I think it'd be cool for you to see it.
Yeah. Pioneer 10 became the first craft to pass into interstellar space in 1983. The diagram shows the path of the two Pioneer probes. On the right, the pictorial plaque carried by Pioneer 10 contains information about Earth and humanity.
But it says nothing about the diagram, which is so wild. You see that?
So I'm looking at the diagram.
If you read the
10th
article-
planet,
Yeah.
4.7 billion miles.
And then look at the dead
away.
star. Do you
And
see how
then-
it says equal gravitational pull on
Equal
here?
pull, yeah. Whoa.
Right?
That's really trippy. And this is an official NASA release? Or what is
This is from again the Science and Invention Encyclopedia was in a very prominent encyclopedia series. Some listening to this probably still have some in their basement. They used to come out with volumes every year, and they would update them, and it was like a very, very prestigious. It's not like a obscure encyclopedia. It was a very prestigious encyclopedia set, and they're becoming very rare now. But some people still have them, and if you do, I would recommend holding on to that.
And so in a binary star system, these stars often like move around each other, like
They dance. They do a
okay.
dance. Now, The Great Year, again, I highly recommend people watch that documentary called The Great Year.
Yeah.
It shows that dance beautifully. Now, this dead star seemed to have a massive elliptical orbit. I mean, we're talking an elliptical orbit so big that we never can observe it,
Yeah.
ever. We can never see it.
Are there any big proponents of this theory now that like have tons of data behind it?
Very strange that all I've seen is Caltech investigating this planet.
Yeah.
But there's been, from what I gather, very little on anything else. And that's why I wanted to preserve that image on my website.
Yeah.
So that something like that couldn't die, because it looked like it was being like completely scrubbed. And I'm telling you, the weirdest thing about it is, you saw that diagram, right? Showed the weird thing is that that article, even in the encyclopedia, says nothing. Why would you include a diagram that has information that would completely blow up all of science itself and not say anything? To me, the only thing that makes sense, there's only one thing, is that somebody wanted to keep that in there, but they weren't allowed to say anything. Well, how else does that make any sense? I mean, that would be an entire article
Who are these
itself,
two
right?
astronomers again?
Thomas Van Flandern
Yeah.
and Robert Harrington.
Yeah.
They were the ones who spearheaded looking into this planet, and I believe even the binary star.
They both die of throat cancer.
And they both died of throat cancer.
At what years did they die of throat cancer?
I don't remember off my head. They died in the 90s, though.
Okay. Right after this discovery,
Right.
pretty much.
Right, basically. And then Miles Standish is like, hey, by the way, everything's mathematical and miscalculations, and it's all wrong. And everyone's like, okay, never mind.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
So
Isn't that
crazy.
wild?
Yeah.
And so in my last book, The Stage of Time, I mentioned in there that they're sort of like unsung heroes that are forgotten and that I think deserve to be remembered.
Were they trying to get this out as they're being kind of marginalized?
I believe so.
Miles Standish.
I believe they were
taking over?
writing a whole series of scientific papers in collaboration with each other.
Is anybody in touch with their families or something? Or like, how do-
I'm not sure if anyone's listening to this that knows.
Yeah.
I know that they had stumbled onto something very, very major. And it's just, I'm not saying that necessarily, I don't want to come across as like they were murdered necessarily, but it was very mysterious how they both died.
Fast.
And then after Miles Standish disproves the whole thing mathematically, nobody ever investigates it, it just dies out.
What's his background, Standish?
He became a prominent astronomical figure within the NASA community.
Before we go on, I should say that personally, I haven't seen an abundance of evidence for this binary star system theory that Matt's proposing. But there are ancient civilizations that echo this belief, and even some pretty credible modern astronomers who believe it's possible.
Roughly half of the stars you find in the universe are alone, and the other half are in groups, and often the groups consist of two. One of the stars might have evolved enough so that it has died and has become a white dwarf, and then lost a lot of its heat and became faint as well. But if it's sufficiently far away and sufficiently faint, then it would just sit there and maybe orbit the sun within a few thousand years. Who knows? I cannot have any positive opinion about this, but I would not rule it out.
Perhaps we've already seen our sun's binary companion, but clinging to old theories kept us from realizing it.
If the Earth were a perfect sphere, there would be no precession, because there would be no way to apply that torque on the Earth. But since the Earth spins, it makes itself oblate by that spinning, so it has bulges on the equator. So this leads to a net force which would want to put the Earth upright. That's what the Earth doesn't allow it to do, but the Earth cannot completely escape that pull from the Moon, and instead of being positioned upright, it will shift the orientation of the axis. In other words, it will cause this precession.
All of that's to say, I would maybe hold this theory as somewhat low probability, but incredibly impactful if true. And I would urge every audience member to please research this, the possible scrubbing of the Pioneer mission from NASA, and the important stories of Thomas Van Flandern and Robert Harrington. Okay, I want to get into some of the similarities.
I know, we got off on like
a crazy tangent, and I know that's not what you spend all your time on. So you've uncovered some amazing ancient architecture in Eastern Turkey, and this architecture seems to comport with all sorts of sites all over the world.
Yeah.
So it is kind of proving out this Graham Hancock hypothesis
Yes.
around this proto-civilization that may have existed, because you say that a lot of the techniques are in terms of how they build, the structures,
and the motifs and symbols.
the motifs and symbols themselves line up perfectly. So
Yeah, exactly.
what evidence do we have of this?
So you have that in front of you, and when you want to pull that up, and you can look at it while I'm talking to you.
Yeah.
So to start with, my expertise primarily had been focused a lot of my life over the last 20 years with really becoming try to be as much of an expert as I can on ancient cuneiform languages. Now, cuneiform is not a language, it's a writing style. It's a type of wedged writing style that was adopted or emerged out of the Mesopotamian region. So if we think of languages, like Sumerian is the first language that we know ever existed on Earth, right? It's a type of cuneiform language. And that survived because they etched in these symbols into clay and stone, which can last enormous amounts of time, thousands of years, in comparison to paper, which only lasts 500 to 1,000 years. It's a much more efficient way to record information. Now, when I was studying the ancient Sumerian civilization, who, by the way, invented nearly everything. They invented astronomy, animal husbandry, agriculture, mathematics. They were the ones who first came up with like trigonometry and understanding the solar system. Oh yeah, it came out of Babylon, but Babylon got it from Sumer. That's where, if you saw that recent...
And what's your line between, because I know people talk about just the Fertile Crescent being the cradle of civilization, but what's your line between Sumer and Babylon?
Babylon had what was called an old kingdom and a new kingdom. So it looks like there was an older part of Babylon as well. I want to point out that most ancient places in the world, if they weren't buried under some pile of debris or something like that, they were rebuilt upon. Because it seems like the predecessors that came always knew there was something sacred and special about them. And that was something we see all over the world, which is why so much confusion exists in the archaeological world for who originally built them. And that came out of that region. Now, I was particularly interested in the Sumerians, because the Sumerians had all these mysterious designs, which, by the way, their ziggurats look exactly like that step pyramid design.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's basically the same design.
I thought ziggurats had 7 levels.
Well, the step pyramids can have more than 3 levels. Some of them can have 7. It's based on that step design, though.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we see those 7 levels in things like Madain Saleh in Saudi Arabia, which I showed you images from that as well. But the original a teaching seems to have come out of this concept of these 3 levels, and I can talk about that concept of 3 as we go forward. However, so when I was studying the ancient Sumerian stories, one of the things I focused on is what was our ancient history? Like, these are the oldest writings ever written. They have these incredible stories in these cuneiform tablets, okay? Things like the Atrahasis, the Enuma Elish. I'm sure you've heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Of course.
And all these stories, many, many more, right? Eridu Genesis, Myth of Madapa, Legend of Etana, but they all have these like nuggets of truth within them. Now, a lot of archaeologists would tell you that those were just based on myths. And you even find out that a lot of the Christian stories, like the Deluge and the Noah story, is nothing to do with original Christianity. It was adopted from these ancient Sumerian stories. And you can see the comparisons, right? If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis, and then you compare the flood story, it's like literally almost identical to Genesis. It's clearly it came from that, okay? Now, if you want to get to the core of something, you need to go back to the earliest form of it, if you want to understand that story. Now, I became pretty obsessed with understanding who the best translators in the world, what the forgeries were, the false stuff, right, which exists too.
Real quick, what gives you confidence that the Epic of Gilgamesh was actually the inspiration for the story of Noah and the Ark and the flood?
Well, because the Epic of Gilgamesh contains the original flood story, but it's from Gilgamesh, who is from a later time period. He's from this second iteration that emerged out of that region, not the original Sumerians, but he's from a civilization that emerged out of the Ur. They call them like the Ur civilization, or Ur the Second. It's an area that he was basically a king or a tyrant, the king of the city of Ur, okay? Ur and Uruk, in that area. Now, he writes from an earlier time period because in the Epic of Gilgamesh, he's trying to find the secrets of immortality by going to find a very specific character. And this is what I traced and tracked across all of these texts, but not coming from the lens of like hearsay. I found the best translators in the world who had translated them, such as George Smith in 1875, and then Stephanie Dalley, and then others who have come along, like Samuel Kramer, who are the best Assyriologists in the world. Assyriologist is a term that is a blanket term that includes Sumerian, though. They just call themselves Assyriologists.
Because George Smith was like the first person to
He was the first.
Errata.
He was the one who cracked the Sumerian code. Now, to give people some understanding, we had this time period of not knowing at all what these texts said. Okay, so Sumerian is what's called a language isolate. It doesn't share an alphabet or similarities, many similarities, very, very small similarities with any language on the earth. It's basically like an alien language. And a man named Austin Henry Layard came along in 1848, and he stumbled across this ancient library called the Royal Ashurbanipal Library. Okay, the Royal Ashurbanipal Library is very unusual in the case that it doesn't get a lot of interest. A lot of people talk about the Library of Alexandria, but I feel like the Library of Ashurbanipal should get a lot more interest, along with even the great libraries of Ebla, which is another ancient city in Syria. But these were libraries that had massive amounts of cuneiform tablets that weren't just from that civilization, but they were from many, many civilizations. Ashurbanipal was a very, very powerful king, but he was also a priest, and he existed during what we think of as the Assyrian time period. Okay, so he was an Assyrian king, but there were earlier time periods before him. There was an Akkadian time period, then there was a Sumerian time period. So if we were going to look at it in like a timeline, there was the emergence of a Sumerian civilization, then an Akkadian, then an Assyrian, and a Babylonian, right? So we have this time period that is around 4,000 to 6,000 years old. And in that time period, Ashurbanipal comes into power, and he's like, these stories are incredible. They're connected to my ancestors, Sennacherib and my father, Tigris, and all these other guys, and I want to understand like the most important stories of mankind, right? He recognizes that they are, bar none, the most important stories, and I agree with him. And so what he did is he amassed these armies, thousands of people. And he goes out to every part of Mesopotamia, to every ancient city, gathers all the tablets, all together. He brings them back, creates the greatest library ever known to man, called the Royal Ashurbanipal Library.